Hello everyone and welcome to another episode. So today we have two guests for what will be, I'm sure, a very interesting discussion centred around the meat that's being eaten in the population and the effects that this is having on human and planetary health. So we're pleased to welcome Rebecca Tobi, Public Health Nutritionist and Senior Business and Investor Engagement Manager at the Food Foundation, as well as Dr. Shireen Kassam, Consultant Haematologist and founder of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. So welcome to you both.
Oh, hi Daisy.
Hi Daisy.
Welcome, hello. So starting with you, Rebecca, can you just tell our listeners a bit more about the Food Foundation and your background and the work you do with the organisation?
Lovely to be on today. So I work for the Food Foundation. So we're a charity/think tank. And basically everything we do is about trying to change both business practice, but also policy in the UK to support a shift towards healthy and sustainable diets that everybody can afford and access. And my role at the Food Foundation is I lead on our business and investor engagement team. And we work on all of our projects which are about that healthy and sustainable diet transition.
And Shireen, can we tell listeners a bit about yourself if people haven't heard of you already?
Yeah, thank you. So my name's Shireen Kassam. I hope everyone knows me as founder and director of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. And I also work as an NHS consultant, as a haematologist. And I also work at the University of Winchester, where I provide education on plant-based nutrition and also cancer and lifestyle medicine.
Brilliant. Excellent. So yeah, we're so happy to have you both on. And today we really wanted to focus on the recent report that the Food Foundation published called Meat Facts, which really delves into what meat the UK is eating and why does it matter. So if we start with you, Rebecca, can you give us an overview of the answer of those two questions? Perhaps actually if we start with what meat the UK is actually eating before we go on to why it matters later on in the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we really wanted to understand was, how much meat are we eating in the UK, but also what type of meat, and are there differences in terms of what different demographic groups are eating? Where does that meat come from? To really start to map out what are those pathways to change? Because, we know there's, health and climate change organisations globally are agreed that we need to be eating less meat for both health and the environment. So we sort of wanted a bit more nuance in terms of what was going on. And I think what we found, I guess the sort of top line is we are eating a lot of meat in the UK. So on average, we eat twice as much as the global average. A lot of that meat that we eat is chicken, so white meat. So 42% of the meat we eat is chicken. And that's despite concerns around the way we farm and feed chickens in the UK. But I think what was also particularly concerning for us is just how much processed meat we're eating. So processed meat there's a very strong body of evidence linking processed meat consumption with a number of negative health outcomes, including cancer. And yet we found that, over a third of the meat children eat is processed. So 36% of the meat children eat is processed. And young men as well also emerge as a kind of key group. So men aged sort of 19 to 40, so younger and middle-aged men, eat the largest amount of processed meat of all the demographic groups that we looked at. We sort of also found we were sort of swimming in this food environment where processed meat options are just very available, often very cheap. So, for example, when we looked at fast food outlets, we found that 4 of the 5 most commonly eaten meat-containing dishes from fast food outlets were either processed and or ultra-processed meat. So that's dishes like, sausage rolls and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of processed meat that is just out there as an option. One of the final kind of key takeaways, I think, is we also looked at what are we importing into the UK? And actually, we found that a third of the red meat that we import from other countries into the UK is processed, which I think is concerning from a kind of British farming perspective, because that's those sort of trade deals that are looking to import meat from abroad are potentially sort of undercutting British farmers with imports of cheap processed meat, often produced to kind of lower standards than we have in the UK.
Thank you for that overview. There's a lot to unpack there. Can we ask you, though, how you arrived at this data? So we were particularly interested in knowing, does your data predate some of the sort of surge that we see more in plant-based eating or veganism in general?
Yeah, so we looked at a number of data sources. The main ones were the NDNS, so the National Diet and Nutrition Survey. It is the best source of information on consumption. So what are people actually self-reporting that they're eating? Very annoyingly, not annoyingly, it was great to see. The latest wave of NDNS data came out last week. So we are now slightly out of date, but we will look to redo that analysis. So the NDNS data that we looked at was up until 2019. But we did also look at, alongside that, data from the Family Food Survey, which again is another government data set. This time it looks at purchases. So what food are people buying, both from retail and out-of-home environment? And we also looked at DEFRA and AHDB trade statistics to unpick that picture of what's coming in. Again, as I said, sort of slightly out of date now, the new NDNS has come out. But I think, actually, if anything, I think the last few years, 2021 onwards, have been quite a difficult time for the plant-based sector. And we've seen it shrinking. And I think it's probably important to acknowledge that, even though there has been an increase in plant-based eating, actually the proportion of people saying they're kind of vegan or plant-based is still quite small as a proportion of everybody. So I think it's probably more interesting to think about, what are the flexitarians doing? Probably that surge in interest in plant-based diets hasn't been quite enough to offset just how much meat we're eating.
Doesn't seem to be sustained, maybe. But can I ask you a bit more about the statistic you mentioned? The UK eats twice as much meat as the global average, which I felt was quite shocking. But is that the case in most Western countries where perhaps meat is more accessible or affordable, or is that something quite unique to the UK?
In the report, we looked specifically at the G7 group of countries. So those are the kind of 7, high income, quote unquote, Western countries. And what was interesting is that all of those 7 G7 countries ate more meat than the global average. So there's a kind of clear link there between high income countries and meat consumption. But the UK was in that top tier. So only Canada and the US eat more meat than the UK of that G7 group of countries. You hear a lot of people talking now about peak meat. So this idea that actually levels of meat in high income countries are going to start plateauing or start to drop off. That might be true, but it's also true that as countries become wealthier, meat is often seen as an aspirational food. We're likely to see those other countries, low middle income countries, starting to catch up with levels of meat consumption in higher income countries like the UK and other G7 countries. And that's something that, is not good for the environment and not something that the planetary boundaries, I think, will be able to cope with.
Yeah. And I guess you sort of answered this question already, or maybe it's an impossible question, but how did we get into this position?
Gosh, what a big one. Yeah, I think it's, I'm not a historian of meat, but I think it is interesting just how entwined meat eating is with a lot of kind of cultural and social norms. You have, for example, meat and masculinity. Meat are often hunter-gatherers, particularly things like red meat. They're very strongly associated with virility and masculinity. And so I think one of the things we kind of talk about in the report and was particularly interesting is looking at, okay, well, why are young men eating so much, particularly processed meat, but meat in general? And actually, young men are reporting increased intake of meat, which is kind of running counter to those population level trends we sort of talked about, where you start to see meat consumption falling off. Part of that answer is you've got sort of gym bro culture now. You've got all these kind of idealized notions of masculinity, where it's about protein and being in the gym and kind of hustling and all of that. And I think what you eat then becomes a part of that. And you're kind of increasingly seeing meat drawn into those conversations around, gender and identity and even politics. In terms of how we've got into this situation in the UK, we've got a long history of subsidies which support the livestock industry over perhaps horticulture sectors. If there is a British food culture, it's often thought of as, meat and 2 veg. And it's quite hard to then shift those very kind of ingrained views around, well, I won't be full if I don't have a meat dish, or, it's not going to fill me up unless there's some meat on the plate. And actually, I think the kind of current protein obsession is only fueling some of those kind of views around what a sort of proper meal is and that it, ideally should include meat.
And we'd love to go into all of this in a bit more detail with you as we progress. But perhaps for somebody who's new listening today, why is this level of meat consumption in the UK a problem anyway? Could you perhaps, if you both answer that question, if perhaps we start with you, Rebecca, and then move on to Shireen?
Well, there's a number of reasons to be worried about this. Some of them we don't cover in meat facts, but I think are still valid, animal welfare concerns. The way we farm meat is often, in very kind of industrial, high intensity farming facilities, which raises a lot of concerns around animal welfare. You've also got biodiversity issues. For example, a lot of animal feed is soy. A lot of soy we get from places like South America, where forest is being felled. Essentially what is driving deforestation and having a kind of catastrophic impact on nature loss and biodiversity loss. But the two areas of concern that we focus on are the health one and the environmental one. So from a health perspective, I won't go into this in too much detail, so I won't steal Shireen's much greater knowledge in this area, but certainly particularly red and processed meat are linked with a number of negative health outcomes. So processed meat is classed by the World Health Organization as carcinogenic, and red meat as possibly carcinogenic. And we know that, for example, when you look at cases of bowel cancer in the UK, 13% of those are caused specifically by intakes of processed meat. So there's some kind of really clear health risks associated with high intakes of red meat and intakes of processed meat, full stop. And then from an environmental perspective, livestock production and consumption drive a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So about 14.5% of total global greenhouse gas emissions are driven by the livestock sector. And that's in large part because of the large amounts of land that you need to farm livestock. And then there's sort of other greenhouse gases that ruminant animals like cows and so on will just produce naturally, like methane. And all of that has a huge impact on greenhouse gas emissions globally, but also specifically those associated with food systems.
Thank you. Shireen, can we bring you in here with your expert knowledge?
Yeah, well, I think Rebecca's covered some really important points. And I guess the only thing I'll add really is that, if we're eating so much in the way of meat and ultra-processed foods, it's to the detriment of all the foods that we know prevent chronic disease, protect our health, and are associated with longer, healthier lives. And I think the recent NDNS data that Rebecca refers to is pretty shocking, even for us that, are in the know, because diet quality in the UK has really deteriorated, it seems, since 2019. Less than 10% of children and adults are meeting the fibre requirements. I think it was 9% of children are eating 5 portions of fruits and vegetables a day, and 17% of adults. So it's that trade-off, isn't it? Foods are not sort of good or bad, but it's kind of what it's associated with. And when you think about meat and the fact that it's the animal protein, the saturated fat, the heme iron, the lack of fibre, lack of the array of phytonutrients that you find in plant foods is driving things like insulin resistance, an unhealthy gut microbiome, inflammation. And we're not even attempting to counter all of that with a decent amount of fruits, vegetables, legumes. The whole trajectory of our diet quality is going in completely the wrong direction, of which, our high meat consumption is one of the detrimental factors.
Shireen, I think all the reasons why we'd like to exclude meat from diets are there from a health and environmental perspective. But coming back to basics, and as Rebecca has already said, we know that the Brits aren't the best cooks. There's almost a tradition of eating in a meat and 2 veg way. And when you look at the Eat Well guide, it recommends that 12% of our diets should be comprised of protein sources. And my question would be, playing devil's advocate, wouldn't meat be the easiest way to get to this? And as well as to say good levels of iron in the diet, do we actually trust the public to get to this sort of level of healthy nutrients by switching relatively quickly to plant-based sources?
So I think that is a genuine question and concern, and I've certainly heard it from policymakers as well, because the concern is that if people just remove meat from the diet, certain vulnerable groups won't be achieving their protein requirements, because we know that the Brits are eating less than a third of a portion of beans a day. So it's not going to be suddenly that, the meat's going to be replaced by beans and lentils and tofu, because British people just aren't eating that, and probably know even less how to cook plant sources of protein. And similarly, the argument with iron, I think, the Meat Facts report clearly states that we're obtaining iron from fortified cereals and meat. And so suddenly sort of asking women, children to replace meat with something else, when we know that the British public are not prioritising iron-rich sources of plant foods, it is a genuine concern. And I think that's why public health messaging is directed mainly at that high meat consumers, rather than the middle ground and asking them to eat less. It's trying to get the high meat consumers into more of the eat well range of sort of protein consumption. But so when it comes to protein, we're eating plenty. We're probably getting on average 17% of our daily calories from protein sources. So I don't think protein itself will be a major issue because we're already over consuming that. But when it comes to micronutrients like iron, I think we do need more public awareness of healthier sources of iron. But it's interesting to note, though, that there is a current review of data and literature sources around what the healthy intakes of iron are, and actually it's on the list of topics for SACN, so the Scientific Advisory Committee for Nutrition, to review, because we rely on quite old data, and the suggestion is that actually we don't need as much as what's being currently recommended. But if we were going to switch away from meat as our main source of iron, we would need to make sure people are prioritising plant sources of iron such as beans and greens and nuts and seeds, which currently people are not doing. But that's not a reason not to change, because we know the current diet pattern are lacking in fibre and folate and vitamin C and all these other really healthy nutrients. So, there's an opportunity to improve diet quality if we were going to support people to eat less meat, but replace that meat with beans and legumes. And the other thing I'd say about the Eat Well guide is that we're sort of getting quite out of consensus with other country-based dietary guidelines. So if you think about the Eat Lancet planetary health plate, which was created to be sort of a global reference, when it comes to red meat, it suggests 14 grams a day is maximum for health and for planetary health outcomes, whereas we've said no more than 70 grams. So we're really way off. And then if you look at dietary guidelines like Austria and also Finland or Norway, they've also set limits on how much meat people should be consuming. So Austria actually says 0 to 300 grams of total meat a week. So that's much lower. So I do think we need some updating there. And what I'd like to see is for that section on protein to clearly state what proportion should be from plant sources and what proportion could be, if desired, be from animal sources. And we don't give any direction on the proportions. Health Canada, which we all love their guidelines, say that 50% or more of protein intake should be coming from plant sources in their protein section.
When we're talking about this, we're quite familiar, aren't we, with what processed meat is, with what red meat is, with what white meat is, and that's all set out in the report. And I wondered if you were surprised from that statistic in the report that a third of the meat that children eat is processed. What are your thoughts on that? It sounds like a worrying statistic. Do you think people really understand what processed meat is?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually. And I think in terms of what people consider as processed meat, I think people are confused. I have these conversations in the hospital space with the catering managers, for example, and they go, oh, and just remind me, what is processed? When I'm talking about removing processed meat. So yes, absolutely. And then when you take it that one step further and say, well, did you know it's known to be a direct cause of colorectal cancer? They're like, oh, really? Oh. So I do think we've got more to do in terms of messaging around meat. And when it comes to red meat, again, it's any meat from a mammal. It's a simple definition, but I think when people think about pork or even venison, people are not necessarily putting it into the category of red meat and being associated with all of those health harms. And then to think that children, a third of the meat that they're consuming is classified as processed is pretty shocking. And we should all be concerned about that, because we know that these sort of our dietary habits are very much formed in childhood. What we do as children is often carried forward as being our traditions or norms or, culturally appropriate for people. We're worrying, every other week there's a journal article saying how we're worried about cancers, particularly gastrointestinal cancers, occurring more frequently in young people, meaning under the age of 50 years. And then, research is going, but we're puzzled about why this would be. But actually, there's some common sense reasons why this might be the case. Our diet quality is really deteriorated. We're not looking after our gut microbiome. We're over consuming meat and ultra processed foods and barely consuming enough fruits and vegetables. And so this is harbouring future problems, which we know start young in life. So, cancer cells are going to be there from a young age waiting to form a cancer. We know that atherosclerosis, which is associated with high consumptions of meat, starts in childhood, if not earlier. And so I think it's really very sad because we're setting up our children for a lifetime of chronic conditions that are ultimately preventable.
Absolutely. And we're relying on their parents to really understand what the messaging is and how to put that into practice. Certainly, as a GP, I've been observing people saying, yes, I've cut out red and processed meat, but then in the next breath they say, I'm just eating lamb or I'm just eating pork, because they don't realise that it's a red meat. Anyway, Rebecca, did you want to come in at this point?
Yes, I was just going to add to what Shireen was saying about the kind of confusion. And actually, that was something that, so I'm a nutritionist, that's my background. And I think you sometimes forget, you're in such a sort of bubble of technical conversations. But we were I was interested by some of the media coverage around the report, where actually it was very clear that not everybody really understands exactly what is in that processed meat category. So things like ham, I think people were sort of surprised that is a processed meat. And to your point, I don't think people necessarily think pork is a red meat either. So it is a bit confusing, really, because when you eat it, it's a white meat. But I think another thing that's kind of confused the waters a bit is obviously ultra processed foods. And you get meats. Some meats are in that NOVA category 4, ultra processed category. Others are in category 3, processed. Maybe that's confusing people, but, independent of the effects we see with ultra processed meat products, there are negative health outcomes associated with the processed meat definition as the NHS defines it.
I'm going to shift gear slightly here because I wanted your thoughts from both of you on a statement in the report, which is quite an aspirational statement, which is in response to the amount of processed meat that's actually imported and sort of controlling things from a regulatory point of view. And that statement is enshrining a set of core environmental and animal welfare standards in law for all agri-food imports, with a minimum threshold that imports must meet in order to access the UK market, is crucial in ensuring that the food and meat we eat does not rely on harming nature elsewhere. So we would ask, first of all, can you even hypothetically get to standards for the production of food, particularly for meat and dairy, that protect nature? And if you do, what are the chances of being able to work these reliably into our importation systems? And that, I think, comes from the bit of the report that says that of our processed meat, I think 50% or something like that is imported. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Rebecca.
Yeah, so it's a third of the red meat we import is processed.
Right.
It was interesting when we dug into the data of that processed meat that is imported, about half of it, 49%, is sausages, which is there's a stat you never thought you'd come across in your day job. So there's a lot of meat being imported that I think we can probably assume goes into the out-of-home sector and is not going to be particularly helpful for us. I think you're right. It's an aspirational statement, but I think we need to be clear about what we want to see the food system delivering on, particularly with the food strategy at the minute. And I think we were particularly thinking about the trade deals that we know the UK is striking at the minute, and what are the opportunities there to make sure that, are we expanding export opportunities for British livestock, which goes against the CCC, the Independent Climate Change Committee's recommendation to reduce UK livestock numbers, but also what are we importing from other countries? Because if we're having, preferential tariffs or agreements about importing, for example, Australian or New Zealand lamb, that's just a random example, what are the implications there, both for British farmers? Are we undercutting them for that kind of nature piece? Because we do offshore a lot of climate change and biodiversity harms elsewhere. But I think it is interesting that, for example, recently we had the new US trade deal agreed in May. And actually a lot of the news coverage of that was centered around, will we have chlorinated chicken or hormone treated beef coming into the country because of that agreement? So it is clearly something that hits a nerve with the public. I think when you look back at the manifestos that all the parties had in the last election back in last summer, one of the things that all the manifestos had in common, from Reform right through to the Greens, was commitments to increasing the proportion of food sourced, either locally or from British producers and farmers. And so I think, if you go back to the manifesto commitments, we need to be talking about trade, and we need to be thinking about where we're importing our food from, because that is going to undermine those commitments to support British farmers and growers, which we know resonates with the British public.
Right. And Shireen, would love to hear your thoughts on that, because obviously there's a point in there, which is, the Food Foundation's aspiration that you can find meat and dairy somewhere in the world and produce it whilst protecting nature.
I guess I would answer that question differently. Currently in the UK, we're eating twice the global average of meat. We need to at least cut our meat consumption by 50% if we're going to meet the sort of Eat Lancet dietary recommendations, probably up to sort of 70-80% if you see the reports from WWF. We produce enough for that. We're currently overproducing meat from sheep and lamb, so we're an exporter of lamb. We're already sort of about 85% sufficient in beef production and about 60% self-sufficient for meat from pigs. So what is the requirement for us to import meat at all? Let's celebrate what we're doing here and keep it to the minimum, and then concentrate on all the foods that we know we should be prioritizing, the horticulture industry. Because if we cut down the amount of meat we're eating, met the Eat Lancet planetary health recommendations, we would free up so much land and be able to either redirect that to eco services, whether that's for carbon capture, for reforestation, for rewilding, or we could use it to grow crops, all those fruits and vegetables that we're currently not growing at all. I think the aspiration is that we have food sovereignty, that we're proud of all the food that we grow here in the UK, and we can weather the shocks that are going to come to the food system globally through climate change. We need to be more self-sufficient. So I would suggest that we shouldn't be importing any meat at all. If most of it is processed, well, it's harming our health. So it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? So we're importing something that not only is harming our health and the environment, it's then adding on that pressure to health services to deal with the chronic illness that our unhealthy diet is driving. So it seems crazy to me. I don't agree with the fact that UK has, exemplary animal welfare standards. We only have to look at the papers or listen to the news recently to see all of those undercover investigations into every single farmed animal industry, whether it's pigs or chickens or cows or fishes, to know what a devastation that industry is to the individual animals. And so I don't think we can hold our heads high around animal standards at all, animal welfare standards. And so before pointing the finger to other countries, we need to really resolve the issues we have in our own farming industry, because 85% of the meat that we consume in the UK is from factory farms, and most of the general public are against factory farming. So if that is the case, we have to severely limit the amount of meat we're consuming, and 0 is the right amount to consume if we're truly concerned about the welfare of animals.
Rebecca, we're going to ask you now a bit more about the section of the report that talks about public attitudes towards meat and eating meat. We found it really interesting that there was quite a large number, 57% of people were, when asked the question, are you open to changing your diet to be healthy and more sustainable? The 57% of people said yes, and they would welcome help to do so. But there was a smaller number, only 43%, that intended to increase their consumption of a range of plant foods. So what do you think might be happening here? Do you think people are willing to take on the plant-rich messages, just not yet? Or that the gap is caused by the idea that you can have a healthy diet and more sustainable, but you don't need to increase your plant intake?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think what was interesting about this section is we looked at 2 quite large sort of public surveys. One is the Eating Better Public Attitude Survey, which has been running for about a decade now. So you get some quite interesting trend analysis there. And another one from Hubbub, the environmental charity. And they both aligned very closely to one another. I think you can take from it some really encouraging stuff. Actually, often feels like talking about how, the need to eat less meat is a bit of a toxic conversation. But actually, when you look at the public attitude survey, the majority of people are open to the idea of changing diets, and kind of open to shifting them to be more environmental and healthy. So that's encouraging. But I mean, I think that the big barrier here is there's a bigger intention action gap. So even if consumers are interested in the concept of plant-rich eating, we know that they're just not supported to do that in the food environments that we all live in. So whether that's, you're walking down your high street, what is the food on offer in the shops or the fast food outlets? It's probably meaty. It's probably processed meat. So, for example, we did a piece of research last year, and about 58% of the main meal options in some of the UK's largest kind of cafe and restaurant chains are all meaty. Where is the choice when you're eating out? Also, when you look at, the retail environment, a lot of those kind of promotional deals are kind of skewed towards supporting kind of meaty dishes over the kind of plant-rich foods we would all want people to be eating more of. So, for example, about 10% of supermarket volume promotions or bog-off deals are on processed meat products, and that compares to just 5% of those deals on fruit and veg, which I think everybody would agree are a good thing for both diets and the environment. So, we've got an issue there, and I think we really need to kind of start moving away from a focus on individual responsibility. We've spoken about confusion around what processed meat is, etc. But actually, should people know that? Or should it just be that when you're buying your weekly shop or you're eating out, that actually you do have tasty, affordable, accessible plant-rich options? Because we know that, what the food on offer, what's made available, appealing, affordable, is ultimately what drives food choice. And I think we need to tackle that. And I think one of the interesting things that did come out from that, one of the public attitude surveys, was that actually 40% of people that responded said that supermarkets and restaurants should be providing more plant-based options.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because we know that if you ask people about do they eat 5 portions of fruit and veg a day, they will say, yes, I do. But obviously, when you do a survey, you find that that's not the case. And we know that shops ultimately sell what they put on the shelves, what they think people want to buy. And talking about that public attitude survey, that I think the same one that you mentioned there, the eating better one, the number of people that report that they're eating less meat than they did, say, a year ago has increased over a 7-year period. So I think the report said it's gone from 19% up to 26% over 7 years. And I wondered there whether you were finding that those kind of self-reporting questions where you ask an individual, does that match what is actually happening when you measure how much meat is being sold, for example?
One of the issues with dietary surveys, whatever type of food you're looking at, is it is really difficult. But then, if I asked you all, what did you eat last Tuesday lunch? I bet we'd all struggle. It's really hard. So we do know that there is underreporting, particularly in the NDNS, which is what we based a lot of the analysis of. I mean, it's the best source of data that we do have, but I think we do need to acknowledge that there is almost certainly some underreporting going on. And interestingly, when we looked at the FFS, so the Family Food Survey, what people are buying, the sort of absolute numbers in terms of how much meat people are buying was higher than how much meat people said they were eating. So I think there are kind of discrepancies there, but I think, we do need to acknowledge just how hard it is for people to be able to access and afford the minimally processed plant foods that we'd all like to see people eating more of.
On that note, I'm really interested to hear what Shireen has to say about chicken, because one of the things that the report highlights is that there's been a shift from red meat to white meat, say, because people have had that messaging. And the report acknowledges there's a better health profile of white meat compared to red and processed meat. Reading the report without any bias, wouldn't we say, isn't this good news?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? We know we're shifting people a little bit away from red meat, but increasing chicken consumption. And this is often known as the omnivore's dilemma, isn't it? Because, if you're shifting away from eating meat from a cow to eating meat from a chicken, you're by definition going to be killing more animals and increasing the suffering of those animals. We've already got, billions of chickens in terrible conditions that are then creating additional health harms compared to just the harm that arises from eating meat. So if I just focus in on the health aspects of consuming white meat or meat from chickens and turkeys, I think we have overestimated by design the kind of health benefits of consuming white meat rather than red meat. And it's worth, I think, at this point highlighting this large sort of systematic review of about 44 studies looking at the health impacts of red meat, particularly. Many of those studies, most of those studies are funded by the meat industry. And what they've shown is that actually, if you shift to eating white meat, there isn't much of a health differential. As I say, we have overestimated that potential benefit of removing red meat and replacing it with white meat. So high intakes of chicken are associated with higher risks of overweight and obesity, high rates of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol. The way that we improve our health is if we move towards eating plant sources of protein. And the study I mentioned clearly showed that if you remove red meat from the diet and replace it with beans and lentils and pulses, you have a major reduction in the risk of various common chronic conditions. So health-wise, I don't think there's that much in it. If you're doing it for health, you are much better replacing your red meat for beans and pulses. When it comes to environmental metrics, again, it's difficult to justify moving from red meat to chickens because we know that at the density we're farming chickens, we've got a real problem with the waste they're producing, so their feces, which is polluting land, air and waterways. The River Wye and the pollution in that from chicken farming has been widely publicised, rightly so, with court cases going on, because it's devastated the local biodiversity and quality of the water for use by us. We are no longer able to enjoy riverways and waterways because of the pollution from farming. And then Rebecca also already mentioned, the fact is that as George Monbiot would say, there's more soya in your chickens than we're eating as humans, as everyone sort of points the finger at plant eaters to say we're causing the deforestation of South American rainforest. Well, actually, it's that soya that we're feeding to chickens that is really contributing to deforestation, and that's what our farming industry in the UK is contributing to. And then, of course, there's, the use of antibiotics in highly densely packed animal environments and the bird flu viruses that are circulating constantly. In the UK, over the last few years, we've literally killed millions of birds in order to prevent the spread of bird flu H5N1, which has not only jumped from birds to mammals, but now there is mammal to mammal transmission and there is transmission from mammals to humans. What hasn't quite happened yet is human to human, but I think most of us would suggest that that's an inevitability unless we can control the generation of and the spread amongst birds. And so all of those issues will get worse if we just replace meat from cows and pigs and lamb to eating chickens instead.
It's also unfortunate because it comes back to what Rebecca was saying about meat and masculinity. And I think the main people who seem very keen on eating chicken are people that are perhaps overeating on protein and putting chicken into many different meals a day to try and get a gym body, basically. And that seems particularly tragic.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, the science is absolutely clear that the source of protein is healthier if you obtain your protein from plant sources like beans and lentils and tofu and chickpeas and so forth. And it has an equivalent ability to support athletic performance, whether that's endurance or muscle building, strength. There is no difference. If you're matching it, for quantity, there's no requirement to consume protein from animals. And that's been made absolutely clear in randomized studies, systematic reviews, meta-analyses. So again, misinformation and by design from the industry that wants us to eat more and more meat, essentially.
Completely. So thank you both. You've made it really clear what the problems are and what we need to do about them. But I suppose my question, or if I can lead the conversation towards the next steps and solutions, if I start with yourself, Rebecca, given that the majority of participants in the Eating Better survey are open to change and welcome help to do so, how can we action this finding? I know your report breaks it down into areas, say, for business and policymakers and investors, but perhaps you can give our listeners just a few examples of where you think the trajectory should be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to shift diets towards more plant-rich patterns, we're going to need multi-stakeholder action. So it's not enough for any one stakeholder group, whether that's businesses on their own or individuals, to kind of turn this ship around. We're going to need lots of different levers being pulled on. But I do think there are some kind of really clear solutions that we can bring to the table. So, for example, in terms of what policymakers should be looking at, mandatory reporting is something that actually does have a lot of support from businesses and investors. And that is that, it should be mandatory for all large food businesses to publicly disclose on what proportion of their sales are coming from fruit and veg and animal to plant protein. That's something that a lot of retailers are already reporting privately to WWF. That should be public, and that information should be used to kind of track where we need to head, where's the direction of travel. I think public procurement is also a huge opportunity area. Millions and millions of meals are served every week in the UK in public settings like hospitals, schools, prisons, workplace canteens. That is an environment where the behaviour change shifts that you're asking of people. If there are two options and they're both meat, which is probably the case in a lot of canteens, that's not great. Whereas just making sure that the food on offer in those public settings is, plant rich, and we're trying to, bump up beans and veg rich dishes could make a huge impact in terms of what people eat in their day to day. I think from a business perspective, we need to see a shift away from processed meat, and we need to see a shift away from being so reliant on animal protein, full stop. Things like increasing promotional spend on those minimally processed plant foods would all be very welcome. For example, if you look at kind of advertising spend, just 2% goes towards fruit and veg. I'm not even sure where pulses sit in that pie chart. There's probably very little spend. And that, that is in contrast to, I think it's about 36% of spend on sort of confectionery categories. So, we need to kind of rebalance where the marketing spend and where the promotional effort is going. And I think that should kind of filter through right across the supply chain. So even things like, ready meals or meal deals, those kind of commonly used products and deals that you get in supermarkets, where are the plant options that make it kind of an easy shift for people. So those are just a kind of a few of our key recommendations. But actually we've got some in the report, but we also published last month or 2 months ago now a policy briefing called Low Hanging Fruit, which basically sets out what are the kind of pragmatic, easily implementable solutions, many of them already kind of schemes that already exist in the UK that could help people to kind of shift towards more plant-rich diets. And that's got a lot of recommendations in as well for anybody interested.
Brilliant. We'll put both those links in the show notes. But Shireen, can we ask you, what do you think the role is for healthcare professionals or hospitals or even GP practices when it comes to this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to all, as healthcare professionals, understand the data, understand the impact on health and the environment of our food choices, and support our colleagues and our patients and our staff members to really also understand and then, shift behaviours. I mean, it would be greatly supported if hospital meals role modelled and showcased delicious, nutritious, plant-based options. And again, we're a little bit far away from that, and it's an area of work that I know our listeners will understand we're really passionate about changing. But I think, it's our duty as healthcare professionals to support our patients to make those better food choices, whilst acknowledging there will be barriers that need to be overcome. But maybe signposting our patients to really great community initiatives where food is being made sort of available at low cost, as teaching cooking skills like, some of the community cook schools like Made in Hackney or Joyful Greens in Godalming. And they're all popping up all over the place to help people sort of upskill in terms of, making these delicious, nutritious plant-based meals. And then, of course, as Rebecca says, we so need to see that policy shift, because you'll know in general practice, you're mainly dealing with problems that could be ameliorated if there was proper, social economic support for healthier habits across the board. But it's no excuse for us as healthcare professionals not to sort of understand the implications of a healthy diet and try and shift that and use our trusted voice to influence policymakers to shift to policies that support a healthier diet across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. There's enough evidence now, isn't it? That's very clear. But you mentioned barriers. Could you talk a little bit more about what you feel are the barriers that we're meeting at the moment?
Yeah, well, so barriers in terms of the healthcare profession, I think we've highlighted some of those in the research that we've done as an organisation. I think we realise that nutrition and dietetic curricula really haven't kept pace with this need to provide education on sustainable plant-rich diets. So our survey of 335 dietitians in the UK and Ireland, even the dietitians that had qualified in the last 3 years, felt that their courses didn't provide them with enough knowledge or skills to be able to support people to shift to a plant-rich diet pattern that we'd modelled on the Eat Lancet Planetary Health diet. So not even 100% plant-based. They weren't even comfortable or knowledgeable enough, they felt, to support patients to shift to an Eat Lancet type diet. And then they also didn't feel supported in the workplace. So dietitians within the hospital didn't feel supported enough. And that might be because the catering services are telling them that they can't provide plant-based meals that are adequate in protein and calorie content. They can't match them to the meat dishes. And that's certainly what my dietitians at work are telling me, that our private catering partner can't provide a like-for-like meal, which is, it's just shocking to me that that is the case. But those are the sorts of barriers. So I think education hasn't caught up. Even amongst healthcare professional circles, plant-based eating hasn't been normalised. We haven't been able to bring our, colleagues along with us in the masses to truly understand the benefits to health, planet, the One Health objective of plant-based eating. And then, of course, we're firefighting all the time with the acute problems, certainly in the hospital setting. Managers and CEOs are much more concerned about A&E waiting lists, operation waiting lists, and the everyday sort of health promotion, whether it's for staff or patients, is given no time at all. So I think, those are just a few of the barriers we face as healthcare professionals, I think.
I think there is a lot of misinformation about particularly protein. You have to eat meat to get a complete protein, over the course of the day. On a plant-rich diet, you are going to get your full lineup of amino acids. And actually in the UK, we're eating about 50% more protein than the recommended amount. So, protein deficiency is not a risk at a population level in the UK. There's lots of misinformation about plant-based diets. I think the waters have been muddied by the ultra-processed food debate. And I think actually the UPF narrative has been weaponized against plant-based. Actually a lot of the meat we're eating, as this report found, is ultra processed. So, where does that leave plant-rich diets? So I think there's misinformation, but I think also there is a nervousness around getting into this space, because talking about meat reduction has become quite politicized. It's bound up with identity, politics, gender. And I think, we need to sort of detoxify the conversation to give policymakers and businesses the confidence to act on this. I think a lot of businesses, most food businesses in the UK have net zero targets. They're not going to meet those unless they reduce scope 3 emissions, which will depend on reducing a reliance on sales of animal protein. There's an acceptance that we need to shift, but we just haven't seen that kind of quite translate yet into those kind of decisive policy and business actions that we need to see to really start to kind of shift the whole food environment so that it is much easier to just have those kind of plant-based options available and affordable and appealing.
Thank you, Rebecca. That's very clear. And now, because we are plant-based health professionals, and at the end of our podcast, we always love talking about food. We've gone from asking people about their dinners to asking them about seasonal vegetables, but we thought it might be particularly apt to ask you both what plant-based dish you might prepare for a keen meat eater to ease them into plant-based eating, as it were. So if we could start with you, Shireen, maybe.
Goodness, talking about what I actually eat is never feels comfortable. But I think while I was thinking about this, I was thinking, of my handful of dishes I cook regularly, probably like a Mexican. I make a black bean chili, and then you have the tomato salsa and the avocado, and it's easy to find, or use cashew cream or a tofu dressing to get that sort of white sauce feeling to it. And I think because it's something that you load up with loads of veggies anyway, I think for me it's easy to persuade people that the black bean is just a small part of an overall dish, and swapping it out for the red meat is it is easy, and it's not going to take away from that the flavour profile of such a dish. So I think Mexican food in general is quite easy to sort of make bean rich, because it is mainly based around beans, isn't it, and starchy veg and things.
Yeah, it lends itself really well, doesn't it, to plant-based eating, all those gorgeous spices. Thank you. What about you, Rebecca?
For the really hardened meat eaters, I mean, I know it contains cheese, but it's still a step in the right direction. I think an aubergine bake is really a good one, because it, people don't feel like they're having to forego anything. It's pretty easy, just chuck it all in a dish and put it in the oven. But I think, you can't go wrong with a really good roast veg, roast some sweet potatoes and some other veg, chuck in a few beans or peanuts or what have you. That's always a winner.
Like a one pan roasted. There's a whole book on this, isn't there? Like a one pan roasted book. I love that. Easy. Claire, have you got one that you wanted to share?
Not in particular. I suppose, people who have been very vocal about not enjoying vegan food, and then you find yourself in a position, through friendships, you might have those people over for dinner, always make me a little bit nervous. And I'm so keen to showcase that I've had to think about this many times. And I think I always land on probably pretty similar to Rebecca. I go for something like a moussaka, where people would be used to the fact that it was layers of aubergine, and you can do, obviously there's many different ways you can do a plant-based cheese sauce, but then putting in either walnuts and lentils or something to make the meat, and or even soya mince. And so it's very difficult for them to criticize that dish. I probably steer clear of things like meat substitutes, because they lend themselves too much to criticism, and this doesn't taste like meat, etc., etc.
Yeah, but you're right. If you've got that soya mince in a moussaka, no difference, is there? It's delicious. No. Yeah, lovely.
And what's your answer, Daisy?
I'm going to be a bit controversial, actually, and say tofu. And the reason I say this is because when I transitioned, I had a young son, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a bit tricky, but he loves crispy tofu. So just really simple, just coated in corn flour and fried, and then add that into a nice sauce, an Oriental style sauce. And it was a Bosch recipe, and it stood the test of time. It's become like a weekly in our house, because I just think until you really experiment with tofu, you think, I don't really like tofu, but once you learn how to cook it, it's a game changer. So yeah, that's what I would make, and people seem to like it. So
completely, yeah.
If it pleases a fussy teenager. So on that note, we wanted to say thank you once again, Rebecca and Shireen, for your time. If people want to find out a bit more about you or connect with you, where can they find you? If we start with yourself, Rebecca.
Probably LinkedIn is the best place. I'm very sporadic about posting, so it's probably better to follow the Food Foundation. We're on X and LinkedIn and all the usual places. Post quite regularly.
And they can listen to your fantastic podcast, which I've been a fan of for
a long
time.
Good words. Yeah. Yes, they can.
Yeah, brilliant. We'll put all those links. Thank you. And Shireen?
So I think for me personally, LinkedIn would be the easiest place to connect. And then obviously for anything to do with plant-based health professionals, we're on all the social media platforms. So Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn, actually.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. There's been a lot of food for thought, hasn't it? Thank you both.
Thank you.